On the 30th of September 1946, a Japanese general made his way out to a firing range and was secured to an execution stake as a firing squad made up of enemy soldiers stood opposite him. He was a man who had committed a huge number of atrocities during his time in command, and like many other Japanese generals, Takashi Sakai would be condemned for his crimes. But the Japanese armed forces during World War II and before were known for their slaughter and execution, and it's believed that they were responsible directly for the slaughter of around 14 million civilians during raids on cities such as Nanking. Japanese officers even shockingly had a race to see who could execute 100 people with a sword the quickest, and this became almost a sporting event which was reported on. But the horrors inside of cities would haunt the Japanese, and many members of the military and government would find themselves condemned to death at the end of the Second World War, and they became known for some of the most evil crimes committed in history. Join us today as we look at the ruthless executions of the Japanese general shot by his enemies, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Takashi Sakai was born on the 18th of October 1887, and he was born in the Kamo district of Hiroshima. As many young men would in Japan, he would pursue a career inside of the military, and he would then attend military school to prepare his career as a soldier, and he studied in Japanese cities before he graduated from the 20th class of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1908. Following this, he was assigned to the 28th Infantry Regiment, and he would then graduate from the 28th class of the Army Staff College. But in 1928, Sakai was based in the Shandong province in China during a Jinan incident. This was when Japanese soldiers had been based in the region to protect the Japanese commercial interest, and peace would be broken between the Chinese and Japanese, and this resulted in the deaths of civilians, as around 16 Japanese civilians were killed and 28 soldiers died, but on the Chinese side there were over 6,000 civilians and soldiers killed. The Japanese reprisals were brutal and barbaric, and there was a lack of understanding and remorse. But some historians claim that Sakai's forces were responsible for the slaughter of Chinese army emissaries during peace negotiations. But following this, Takashi Sakai was promoted to the rank of colonel, and he then served for a number of years inside of the military intelligence, and he then became involved in the general staff of the army. As a chief of staff to the Japanese China Garrison Army, Sakai would be involved in the planning and waging war and conflict with the Chinese, and he would become a significant aggressor. But there would be an armistice with the Chinese government, but this gave concessions to the Japanese, and in particular gave them Hebei province. But then further promotions came, and Sakai was made the commander of the 28th Infantry Brigade, and he would then be made a Major General in 1937, before becoming a Lieutenant General 2 years later. He continued to command, and during the Second World War, he was the commander of the 23rd Army based in Canton. But he would then be involved in the capture of Hong Kong, and he was ordered to use the 38th Division to take the region. On the 8th of December 1941, hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese forces who were commanded by Sakai and his chief of staff invaded Hong Kong. This resulted in the Battle of Hong Kong. Sakai hoped for this to be over quickly, but it took a lot longer than he expected, but eventually the Japanese would be victorious. The Hong Kong garrison was made up of British, Indian and Canadian forces, as well as Hong Kong Volunteer Defence Corps. Japanese fighters and bombers attacked when they could, and they pushed back the British and Indian troops. But retreating forces had gone scorched earth, as oil tanks and dockyards were blown up, but the Japanese would assault Hong Kong. Thousands were killed, and eventually Hong Kong did surrender. The surrender was delivered in person to General Sakai, and then Hong Kong would fall under Japanese occupation. It's believed that thousands were killed or missing for the Commonwealth forces during the battle, and that around 10,000 prisoners were captured, and these were then subjected to horrific treatment at the hands of the Japanese. Takashi Sakai was frustrated by the strong resistance that he and his forces faced, and this may have been a contributing factor to the occupation of Hong Kong, and specifically how the people were treated. The occupation would last 3 years and 8 months, and there was a huge amount of fear inside the region, and the population would dwindle by 1 million, as people were sent to prisoner of war camps, or they fled or suffered. There was inadequate food supply, and people were given measly rations, and because of this many died from starvation. There were also many atrocities committed by Sakai's forces against the locals, and many women were assaulted. Some were deported to become comfort women for the Japanese army, It is estimated that around 10,000 civilians were executed or were tortured or attacked. There were many other villages which were slaughtered, and Hong Kong suffered greatly. But Sakai would serve as the Japanese governor of Hong Kong until February 20th, 1942, and he was then later recalled to Japan, but he would retire from active service a year later. But then he would be recalled at the end of the conflict in 1945, and he was then to be sent to Beijing, but before he could get there and leave for China, the war would come to an end. But at the end of the Second World War, Sakai would be captured and he was arrested by the American occupation authorities. There were a series of war crimes trials that took place to punish Japanese members of government and also the military who had conducted war crimes and atrocities. At the request of the Chinese government, Takashi Sakai was extradited to China, where he committed many of his crimes, and he was then brought to trial for these specific war crimes. Specifically, he was part of the Nanking War Crimes Tribunal, and this saw a number of high-profile military leaders on trial alongside Sakai, and for his crimes inside of Hong Kong, he was then sentenced to death. The War Crimes Tribunal said about his actions that the tribunal dismissed the accused plea that he could not be held responsible for the above violations because they were perpetrated by his subordinates, and he had no knowledge of them. The tribunal's findings were as followed: that a field commander must hold himself responsible for the discipline of his subordinates is an accepted principle. It is inconceivable that he should not have been aware of the acts or atrocities committed by his subordinates. All the evidence goes to show that the defendant knew of the atrocities committed by his subordinates and soldiers, and deliberately let loose savagery upon civilians and prisoners of war. The principle that a commander is responsible for the discipline of his soldiers, and that consequently he may be held responsible for their criminal acts if he neglects to undertake appropriate measures or knowingly tolerates the perpetration of offences on their part, is a rule generally accepted by nations and their courts of law in the sphere of the laws and customs of war. But Takashi Sakai would be executed in a manner that was different to other convicted Japanese war criminals. As a strong military man, it was said he would be executed on a firing range, and by gunshot, which was considered a more honourable way to die for a soldier. He was led out to the firing range on the 30th of September 1946, and the 58-year-old general was then secured to a stake, and he had his arms and legs tied to a post. Then opposite him was a Chinese execution squad. He had been taken to Nanking for his execution, but then the firing squad was readied, and when the order was given to shoot straight, they did, and executed the former Japanese governor of Hong Kong. Takashi Sakai was a notorious Japanese war criminal, and he was a man who was known for his brutality. He took part in horrific atrocities in Hong Kong and in surrounding areas, and the soldiers under his command he was responsible for were horrific. He would be executed as he was a commander and a general, and the command principle meant he was responsible for the actions of his soldiers, even if he did not specifically order the crimes they committed. But as mentioned, he would not be hanged like many other generals were, but instead was shot. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.